This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're still talking about Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and we're going to look at some more 17 lands data today. Last week we looked at some 17 lands data while discussing some cards that are being overvalued for how they're actually performing. In other words, cards that you should probably stop playing or at least take a lot later. So if you haven't watched that video, you can check that one out because this is sort of a companion piece to it, where we're going to do the opposite. We're going to look at 17 lands data, which tells us when cards are being taken and how well they're actually performing in people's decks. And this time, we're going to look at cards that are being undervalued. Cards that should be taken higher than they are based on how they're actually performing. If you're not familiar with 17 lands, you can check them out at 17lands.com. You can sign up to have them track your data. They track Magic Arena players. And yeah, that's where all the data in this video came from. Alright, so as usual, I have a baseline card to sort of get us started, to give us a feel for what it is we're going to be looking at. This time around, I've chosen Giant Beaver. It has a win rate of 55.9%, and these are all game-in-hand win rates. That's really the most useful win rate on 17 lands, because that means that a card's win rate is affected even by when you have it and you can never cast it. Whereas if you just look at when a card is played, that's going to give you a different number that isn't as reflective of how good a card actually is. So Giant Beaver, if it enters your hand, you have a 55.9% win rate with it. That is not quite as crazy as it sounds. I always need to remind you, 17 lands, users have a higher than normal win rate, and the overall average win rate for 17 lands users in this format is 54.3. So Giant Beaver is markedly above that sort of average of 54.3%, so it's a pretty good card. And I think we can all agree about that. This has been a nice creature for green decks, 4 mana, 4/4 Vigilance, with an ability that actually does something a decent chunk of the time. And it's being taken around pick 5.6. So that's a pretty high pick. I would say it's probably being taken a little too highly based on how it's actually performing, and based on the fact that a 4-drop isn't exactly premium in the format. But suffice it to say, it's a pretty good card, and it's being taken pretty highly. Every card on this list, apart from one, has a higher win rate than Giant Beaver does and is being taken later. And the one that I'm talking about only has a slightly lower win rate. So let's go ahead and dive right in, and let's start with Sterling Supplier. So, this is one I got some flack about in my set review because I gave it a C+. But it's panned out that way. It has a win rate of 56.6%, and it's being taken around pick 9.3. So that is significantly higher than Giant Beaver, but also significantly later. There are a few things going on with Giant Beaver that are interesting. Green is generally considered the best color in the format, so people are automatically going to value green cards a little bit more. But there's kind of a wash there because Giant Beaver's win rate is being pulled up by the critical mass of really good green cards that surround it, right? Data's not perfect. It doesn't tell us the whole story, and this is one of the ways where that's the case. But nonetheless, even with those caveats in mind, Sterling Supplier is doing pretty well. And it, obviously doesn't surprise me. 5 mana, 3/4 flyer that puts a +1/+1 counter somewhere has always been a pretty nice card in Limited. Maybe it's a little better than I expected, but I am surprised people are taking it as late as they are because, having 2 of these in your white decks feels pretty good, even as a 5-drop. I mean, this format's not so fast that a 5-drop is completely in trouble, and that's part of why, it is overperforming a little bit, because having a 5-drop is legit. But, this is a very real body, a 3/4 flying body for 5. Performs okay, and then you're also getting a counter, and usually that counter makes an immediate difference on how you can attack in a given turn. And then you have this big flyer lying around who can also obviously get in for some hits. There are a few ways to bounce it in the format as well that make it a little more interesting sometimes. You can use the Possum or the 3 mana 2/4 rare, which will let you blink things that you crew. There are ways to abuse this ETB that I've encountered at least a few times, me using them and my opponents using them, that make it even a little better too. So It's good. It should be getting taken certainly higher than pick 9. And right now it's really being undervalued by people, as evidenced by the sort of chasm that exists between where people are taking it and what its actual win rate is. Next up, let's look at Humiliate. So this is similar, except it's performing even better. It has a win rate of 57.7%, and it is being taken around pick 9.9. So this card really overperformed in Strixhaven. That's where we originally saw it, and I ended up being a card that I like to play at least one of in lots of black-white decks. And it's, there are a few things going on here that make it better in this format than it would be in most. One of them is just that this isn't a format where you have to have a 2-drop or you die, which is nice. So interacting with your opponent on turn 2 in a pretty big way. I mean, Humiliate really is going to hit a real card. It's going to really disrupt your opponent in a big way on turn 2. And then if you happen to have something on board, it actually does add to the board. You do need something around, but imagine, it's not quite this good, of course, but imagine that this added a 1/1 token to the board when you cast it. That would be, like a Ravenous Rats type card, which is a card that usually performs pretty well. And that's kind of what this does, except in some cases, a counter is even better. Most of the time a token is, to be fair, but sometimes a counter is even better to have. So in addition to that, this commits a crime really efficiently. In addition to that, the fact that the format is slower also means your opponent's more likely to have cards in their hand, even in the later stages of the game. So you just don't whiff very often with Humiliate, and you almost always get the counter. So it ends up being a card that you should play the first copy of in basically all of your black-white decks. Like, it's a legit disruptive spell that really has an additional effect that matters. Let's look now at Ambush Gigapede. So this is one where I talked about this one where I talked about 10 cards I was wrong about a couple weeks back. This was on the list. So, I got this one wrong myself, and people still aren't giving it the respect it deserves. So it has a win rate of 56.4%, which is 0.5%, 0.5% higher than Giant Beaver, which, if you'd told me that, I didn't have the data in front of me, I wouldn't necessarily believe it. But that's what it's doing, and it's being taken around pick 9.4. So there's one thing going on with the Gigapede. It's a 6-drop, and that is significantly more than 5 or 4. So you usually don't want more than one Gigapede, but I still think it's a card that we need to touch on because, it performs pretty well in the format. I talked about some of the reasons why a few weeks back when discussing why I was wrong about it. Again, the format not being the fastest thing ever plays a pretty big role. There are lots of board stalls in this format, too. I mean, it's not unusual to flash the Gigapede in, kill your opponent's best creature by blocking it with the Gigapede, and then kill something small. Like, that happens a decent chunk of the time. And that's not, completely insane all the time. Sometimes it's a 2-for-1, sometimes it's not. But it ends up being a pretty legitimate play. Like, if your opponent has 6 mana up, a card in hand, and they're playing black, you better be thinking about the Gigapede. It gets even more interesting if they have some crime payoffs, because it triggers those at instant speed. And even if you play around the Gigapede, your opponent can usually still flash it in and kill something at the end of your turn. And that's a perfectly reasonable exchange. So the Gigapede just ends up playing quite well in a format that is slower and also has significant number of board stalls that it can completely wreck in the right situation. And then the whole crime angle also ends up really mattering on a lot of board states too. All right, let's look at Plan the Heist now. So this is taken around pick 8. And it has a 56.1% win rate. So one of the best things about this format, in the opinion of someone who likes playing grindy limited games, I don't get to play as many drafts because they take longer, but I like the fact that I'm able to play these long grindy games, and a 4-mana draw 3 in the right format is going to be really good, and this is the right format. Most of your blue decks want 1 or 2 cards that draw you a bunch of cards. This is kind of the one you're hoping for. You'll play the Divination that costs less if you commit a crime sometimes. But Plan the Heist is definitely better. I mean, 4-mana draw 3 is just good. And there are times where you can suspend it. To be honest, a lot of the time it's not that important to suspend it. But there are scenarios where it makes sense to do it, especially if you're trying to double spell, like in a blue deck. Some of your cards care about that. Most of the time, it's just the right thing to do is just cast this thing. It is nice you can splash it because when you plot it, it only asks for 1 blue, so that comes up too. But yeah, I mean, it's a 3-for-1. That's what a 4-mana draw 3 is, and it's an efficient one. And in this format, especially if you've played out like a couple of 2-mana 3/3s and stuff on your first couple of turns, it's you are pretty safe casting this on 4 behind, your defensive creatures. And that ends up being a pretty strong play, and the win rate reflects that. So, all right, so let's look now at the one card on the list that does have a lower win rate than Giant Beaver, but not by an insane amount, and that is Outlaw Medic, which is being taken around pick 8.4 and has a 55% win rate. So this is just, I was talking about defensive 2-drops. This is one of the good ones. White doesn't always want to be defensive in this format, but a 2-mana 1/3 lifelink, it blocks a lot of the 1 and 2 drops in the format and gains you life in the process. And the nice thing about it is, if your opponent does have one of those obnoxious tricks like take up the shield or whatever, sure, your medic dies, but you get a card back. The black-white sacrifice theme, while it pans out sometimes, it's not one of the stronger things you can do in this format. Not consistently, anyway. But it is good sacrifice fodder when you do end up in those situations, and even when you don't. Like, even if you're an aggro deck, like, this is an okay 2-drop too, because enhancing it makes it a lot better. One counter just makes a massive difference on a 1/3, and especially with lifelink. So, it's performed pretty well. It's not as good as the Beaver. That doesn't really surprise me, but I was a little surprised it's being taken, somewhere between an 8th and 9th pick on average. Let's look now at Betrayal at the Vault. So I think this is another card that's suffering a little bit because we're so used to 6-mana removal and stuff like that just not performing that well, and so people have a hard time wanting to take this early, but it has a 56.6% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 6.3. And this is another card, it's better than Ambush Gigapede, as its win rate would indicate, although not by as much as you would think. It's only, 0.2% better? But this is another card that just completely wrecks board stalls, which are pretty commonplace. And it's really good in green. You have, especially in green-black, but in green you have a 1-drop with Death Touch, and that, that card has been as good as 1-mana 1/1 with Death Touches always are. It's pretty good. And it might even be better because you have an uncommon, the best common in the format in terms of win rate is Throw from the Saddle, the 2-mana bite effect or punch effect, whatever you want to call it. And Betrayal at the Vault is at uncommon, and it's really good with both of those cards. And it's really not that hard to manufacture complete blowouts with this. 2-for-1s are very easy. You do have to be careful, as always, with this effect, because it's still vulnerable to removal. If your opponent kills the thing you try to use this on, it's not so good. But if you wait until your opponent's tapped out or they're unlikely to have a way to interact in response, this just wins tons of games when you cast it, because it just usually kills 2 things, and it's an instant, so by the time you untap and have your turn, the board looks way better than it did a minute ago. It reminds me a lot of Spinning Wheel Kick in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which had a higher ceiling, but also was a sorcery. Like, that was an X-costed thing, so sometimes you'd kill 3 things with it in that format. But they both kind of do the same thing in formats that are sort of medium speed to slow a lot of games, because you just use one thing, one card, and kill 2 creatures most of the time with both of them, and it just feels incredible when you do it, and it's not that hard to do. Let's look now at Holy Cow. This is a card that I think we all feel is pretty good, and it's performing that way, but it's being taken a little bit late. It has a win rate of 56.9%, a full percent better than Giant Beaver, and it is taken around pick 6.7. This isn't as egregious as most of the cards we've looked at so far, I don't think. It's being taken maybe a pick too late. It's not hugely different. Some of these have been crazy, right? Given what their win rates actually are. Holy Cow, not so much, but it is still being taken a little bit too late. And yeah, it just gives you all these little pieces of value as a 3-mana 2/2 that gains you some life, and it scries, and it has flash. Sometimes you can flash it in and kill, like the 1/2 first striker for 1 red mana, and you can flash it in and kill a bunch of random creatures in the format. And it even survives some of those blocks, which is pretty good. But, the life gain, having a creature that adds to the board and gains you life is just a big game, especially in formats where you can draw the game out for a while, because even if you just trade with Holy Cow, you come out ahead between those two effects and trading with one of your opponent's card. I mean, it's not quite a 2-for-1, but the effects you get out of Holy Cow are probably worth like half a card, so you definitely come out ahead in most situations. And when it has to, it can also just be able to attack your opponent in the air, and it's certainly good at doing that too. All right, next let's take a look at Phantom Interference. This is a card that I'm very glad is as good in the format as it is. It's another one of these cards I'm happy to see succeeding. It has a win rate of 55.9%, and it's being taken around pick 8.2. This is another one that some people during the set review said they didn't think was going to be as good as I thought it was because of plot. And when people made that criticism, I was like, yeah, maybe they're right. Because if your opponent has mana up in this format, you can just plot a card from your hand, right? So that is a problem sometimes, but it doesn't happen so often, especially like on turn 2, that this doesn't still have the upside of most of these 2-mana counter target spell unless its opponent pays 2 generic. Like, we've seen that a lot lately, and it's always been a quality common. And this still usually can do that on 2 if that's what you need from it. And then in the later stages of the game, when people are making big plays like ambush Gigapede or Betrayal at the vault, you can counter something and make a 2/2 flyer way more often than I even expected in this format. And when you do that, like, that is just an absolute beating. It's a 2-for-1 that's really efficient, especially when your opponent's paying like 6. Then you're actually beating them in mana and in terms of cards, which is kind of nuts. And that lines up a lot of the time, More often than not, I think you fire this off before you get the 2/2, but when you draw it late, it still has that mode. And in a pinch, even if your opponent does play around it, you can still get a 2/2 flyer, which for the cost isn't amazing, but that is an upside most counter spells don't have the luxury of. If you try, like, if the only card in your hand is a counter spell, and you're like, okay, I guess I'll counter something if my opponent plays something, but it's going to kind of stink if I don't get to add to the board, and your opponent just has their turn and passes, you're in a bad spot, especially if they plotted something. Whereas with this, you can still get something out of it, as inefficient as it is. That's sort of the fail case. So Phantom Interference has been really nice. Next up, let's look at Desperate Bloodseeker. So people have come up on this one. I made this list like a few days ago, and the average pick for the Bloodseeker was like 7.5. Now it's 6.46. And it has a win rate of 56.8%. I went back and, to double check if things had changed at all, and this one had, and that doesn't surprise me. This has been a really, really good common. I liked it in the set review. 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink. The upside there is pretty nice already. And then it has this mill effect, which has so much utility in this format. So first of all, you can use it to mill yourself, which is, like if you're in black-green, that's what you're going to do because you have a bunch of cards that are good with the graveyard. But if you're in a deck like blue-black or red-black, you're frequently going to mill your opponent because you have crime things in play, right? And it's not impossible to end up in a mill deck in this format. I've come up more and more each week on the mill deck. I've seen more and more people make it work, and it doesn't always come together. But if you get a couple of Desperate Bloodseekers, a couple of Desperados who, when you commit crimes, mill your opponent, and like an Archive Trap and ways to get creatures back from your graveyard, you can end up milling enough cards that your opponent legitimately has to worry about getting milled out. And then the great thing about the Bloodseeker is it has great utility in like every black deck in the format already, and then it has this like build around potential where you can actually build a legitimate like blue-black mill deck, some percentage of the time. It's not all the time. You shouldn't force it. It's not going to work out. But a great way to get into it is just be like, well, I have 3 Desperate Bloodseekers because they're really good and I'm happy to have them in my deck. And then you start seeing a couple Desperados and stuff like that, and you're like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to see if I can do this. And you can. Like, that deck can win games and perform quite well. So it just does so much. It's also just good defensively. It's good offensively. The life gain is something slower decks want. Being able to turn sideways is something more aggressive decks want. It is really one of these sort of bread and butter commons that you can take with a pretty high pick in this format, certainly higher than 6.4, and feel pretty good about. It'll be interesting to see where it finishes in the format in terms of how highly people pick it. And then the last card I want to look at is also a black card, and it is Lively Dirge. It's being taken around pick 7.4, and it has a 57% win rate. This is one that I misread in the set review, and I thought was better than it was, because I thought it lets you get 2 creatures back with 4 or less each. So, like, you get 2 4-drops back is what I envisioned. And I was like, well, that's pretty good. More than pretty good, really. And it turns out it's not quite that good. However, it's not that hard to get good value out of this. It gets especially interesting when you have the black-green signpost uncommon creature who comes into play and also gets something back from the graveyard. And you can effectively tutor that card up to get something back from your graveyard and put it into your hand. There are times where you can just get back, I don't know, a couple of Bloodseekers or something like that too. That's really, really good. Tutoring up a smallish creature and reanimating it is a pretty real play, and that's kind of what saves the card. If it was only capable of the other part, where you could only get stuff back that's already in your graveyard, it wouldn't be nearly as good. But there are enough really nice creatures that you can tutor up when you cast this, put them in your graveyard, and reanimate them, that you can end up with some pretty great turns where you cast Lively Dirge, and it's not that hard to manufacture them. And that's... If this card was sort of iffy or needed a build around grade or any of that, it wouldn't have a 57% win rate where it's just good, like in all your black decks. And it tends to be. I mean, you don't want to be a super aggressive black-red deck and play Lively Dirge, probably. But, but even then, sometimes it's not bad. Like, you get back the Vile Smasher and an Outlaw or something, and that's some pretty serious value right there. But it's definitely better in, like, black-green and black-blue, the slower decks in the format that can really take advantage of their graveyard. And so the Dirge has been a really nice... It's probably the best, like, non-rare, non-mythic, pure reanimation spell that we've seen in Limited in, I don't know, a really, really long time. I guess the Eldest Reborn might be the best, but that wasn't even really a pure reanimation spell because it had all these other effects. So, Lively Dirge is good, and should be taken higher than pick 7.4. You want one in basically every single black deck. Alright, that does it for this week's video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others are more likely to enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more videos talking about Thunder Junction, videos of me playing Thunder Junction Limited, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.